Okay, and welcome. Thanks for joining us again. As we are still here, Co-op Radio, broadcasting out of Coast Salish territories, 100.5 FM, and at www.coopradio.org. Okay, it's an enormous pleasure to be joined by two journalists who I absolutely admire in this country and have sort of over the last year gotten to know a little bit about their work. We are joined by Pacinthe Mattar and Erica Ifill in a conversation, I hope, between them on their experiences on how the Canadian media and the government has been messaging and managing the current situation, war, call it whatever we want, in Palestine, in Gaza. But let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Pacinthe Mattar is a journalist, a writer and producer born in Alexandria, Egypt, has since called Toronto, Saudi Arabia and Dubai home, has spent over a decade in journalism and media, including 10 years at the CBC, where she was a long-term producer at The Current on CBC Radio 1. She also reported for Deutsche Welle, which is in Germany, as an Arthur F. Burns Fellow through the Washington-based International Center for Journalists. Her journalism has focused on race and racism, police brutality, refugees and migration, violence against women, Middle Eastern politics, pop culture, Indigenous issues, and more. Her work has appeared in Chatelaine, Toronto Life, BuzzFeed, Canadian Business, and Reader's Digest. In 2021, she received the National Magazine Award for her feature essay in The Walrus titled "Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists." The next year, she was selected as a fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Pacinthe has earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto and at Mississauga before completing her master's degree in journalism at Toronto Metropolitan University. And joining her is Erica Ifill, an economist, journalist, podcaster, writer, and analyst who founded Not In My Color and is co-founder and co-host of the Bad and Bitchy podcast. That's Bad Plus with the plus Bitchy podcast, in case you want to look it up, which I highly recommend. It provides critical analysis on politics and pop culture from an intersectional feminist perspective. Erica is also a columnist for The Hill Times, where she writes about federal politics and economics with an equity lens. Her bylines include Maclean's, National Observer, Refinery 29, The Globe and Mail, and Erica can also been seen speaking about equity and politics on CBC, CTV, and CPAC. So thank you, the two of you, for making this time to join us.
Thank you for having us.
Awesome. So, listening to mainstream media, I often think that journalism comes to die in Canada, and then I run into your work and quite sincerely your moral courage, and only beginning to understand the personal pressures and consequences and toll in speaking about these issues that are relevant to our communities within the mainstream media, which you guys have been involved in, and which are more and more, to me, antithetical to freedom of the press and democracy, in my opinion. Your work, to me, demonstrates that journalism is not dead, but, my gosh, the price that you pay is unacceptable. Anyway, it's really good to speak with you here on CFRO Independent Cooperative Media, where we can say, what we want, where we are broadcasting from unceded Coast Salish territories, and we understand that from BC to Palestine, occupation is a crime, which is, really unlike the mainstream media, where we can't talk about these kinds of things. We're not sponsored by anybody other than the community that Co-op Radio is. So maybe to start off our discussion, I'd like to ask you to share your lived experiences in the mainstream media, in the discussion of the stories related to racialized people and systemic racism. So, Pacinthe, you wrote about your experiences in the article published in The Walrus in 2022 titled "Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists," where you outline 3 examples of your own experiences. And so would you please share what led you to write the article in the first place, and perhaps expand on the third example, the last point that rings, as you say, rings entirely true for me, and it's particularly cogent to the present situation in Gaza. Can we start there?
Sure, and thank you for having me. It's great to be able to talk in a environment where I won't be weighing every word with such a high degree of precision and worry, which is often the case, especially on these issues. So it feels comfortable already, and I think that's a wonderful start. So the Walrus article that I wrote in 2020 came as a result of just utter and complete rage at what I was seeing in the media. You'll remember it was just a few days after George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020 that I just saw the moment that we were in the media where yet another black man had been killed by the police, and yet there was still so much doubt about how that happened. The Minneapolis Police Department had said that he was going through a medical episode, was in some kind of medical distress, was under the influence, and then, somehow he just died. And if not for, a 16-year-old girl named Darnella Frazier, a 16-year-old black girl who filmed George Floyd's murder on her cell phone and broadcast it to the world, where everyone, the whole world watched George Floyd be murdered by, a Minneapolis police officer named Derek Chauvin. And that incident, George Floyd's murder, just galvanized the world to finally pay attention. I mean, not that I think many of us have already been paying attention, but there was a wider moment in which we were seeing, the violence that is leveled against black people in America, in North America, but also then the way that the media reports on it. And so I was watching this play out in May of 2020. I had left the CBC the year before, and all I can tell you is that I wrote a pitch to the Walrus in a fit of rage, seeing what was being reported and seeing the same things that happened to me while I was at CBC, which is, people not believing the experiences of black people, people not trusting me to report on stories that I knew intimately. And so the article came as a result of a lot of frustration, and I channeled it into a pitch that was terrible. I can tell you in hindsight, it was a terrible pitch because I was just angry and didn't really have a focus. But the Walrus helped me turn it into the award-winning piece that it was, and I'm forever grateful for them. And so the article is about 3 different instances, and I'll just move to the third one of the racism that I encountered in my 10 years at the CBC. And I'll bring up the third example, which you astutely point to as very relevant, because it had to do with putting a Palestinian American journalist on the air. I was at CBC. It was the year 2017, and I had produced an interview with a Palestinian American journalist named Ahmed Shahabuddin. He was then an Al Jazeera reporter. He was Emmy nominated, and I had seen that on Twitter he was talking about, he was in Jerusalem for some protests, and in the course of his reporting, he tweeted a video of him being stopped, questioned, and kind of jostled around by Israeli security or police forces as he was reporting. And he tweeted the video and said, this is what it's, something along the lines of, this is what it's like to be Palestinian and working as a journalist, so I pitched having him on the show that I was working on at the time. It was a weekly show, not the home show that I was usually at, but anyway, another weekly show. Pitched to have him on to talk about what are the protests happening in Jerusalem, and secondly, what is it like to cover this story as a Palestinian American journalist? That was like the crucial focus that drew me to him. And to make a very long story short, this was the one interview that after it was recorded and edited and ready to put to air, it was the one interview in my entire decade at the CBC that did not see the light of day. It was unceremoniously killed without an editorial discussion. The interview did not get broadcast, and I was left to kind of scramble and pick up the pieces to try to figure out what happened here. And I think it was the clearest case of the degree to which we are not able to have a conversation about Palestine, about Palestinian people, about Israel, about the occupation, and about the actions, quite frankly, of the Israeli military, the Israeli government, Israeli security forces. This is already hard to do when we're talking about traditional police. So, my story also talked about the police in Baltimore. It talked about the RCMP. But then take that into Israel and Palestine, and you have a whole other degree of difficulty, opaque decision-making, and frankly, just almost an impossible bar to meet to get that story. And so that was what I wrote about in my Walrus article.
And it was ironic in a sense that this was a piece that the CBC wanted to begin with.
Yes, this is when I pitched the Ahmed Shahabuddin's interview on a Monday morning at the beginning of our week. They wanted this. They were so interested in the story that they said, "We want this to be our lead story. It's going to be the story that kicks off the show that week." So I was under a lot of pressure to land it, and I got it very last minute on a Friday morning, which is pretty last minute for Radio World if you're making a weekly show. So it went from being the most desired, the most thought upon story that they were really gunning for me to get. And then I landed it, we did it, with, and here's a little behind the scenes. This wasn't an interview we just created on the fly. I had written questions that were then approved by a senior producer. We sat together, me and the senior producer and the host, and went over the questions together. Everyone is on the same page. There were no surprises in this interview. And yet, no one told me after the interview or during the interview that there was any trouble. So it just, it failed every test of editorial process in terms of how they made the decision to kill it. And I can tell you that it was only through writing that Walrus article that I got even a sliver of an idea of what the problem is. They say it was too opinionated. I say we invited him on expressly to give his opinion. That's why we said we want him on our show. But I'll leave it at that for now.
For now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, Erica, a couple of your recent articles caught me on the Hills Times. They were published titled "Selective Acknowledgement of Humanity" and "A Grim Sign of the Times." And also, "The chill in the air is more than a change of seasons." But before we talk about the substance of those articles, would you like to also tell us about your experiences working within mainstream media frameworks, because you also do other things, clearly not in my color and the podcast, but within the mainstream frame, can you talk about your experiences of writing stories that affect racialized communities or are about racialized people?
Well, I thought about quitting. I was close to quitting twice already, and I've only been here for like 6 years. I don't have before media, I was a public servant at the Department of Finance. My journey to journalism takes a lot of nooks and crannies. But essentially what happened was I started a podcast with two of my friends, and we just talked about politics in a really intersectional way. It caught on, and we started writing. And we started pitching op-eds together, and then the Hill Times approached us for a column, and then I ended up writing the column because COVID just kind of hit everybody differently. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started writing the column in 2020 by myself, was really when I started writing by myself, writing and developing a voice, mm-hmm. and developing a style that was uniquely mine. And so, I've been picked up by, I should say, I keep forgetting this. I should say I've been targeted last year by a right-wing harassment campaign. Me, Saba Itazaz, and Rachel Gilmore, and we're the ones who basically got all the newsrooms together. We're the ones who directed the response. We're the ones who directed the police response. We're the ones who directed the politics, like everything. That was the three of us doing all that heavy lifting, and then the Canadian Association of Journalists took all the credit. So, and during that time, I pissed off a white male journalist on CBC because he was editorializing about our harassment campaign and really downplaying it like it's not as important as what the Prime Minister's faced. He literally said that. And then I went on after him to correct him, and he got pissed, sued CBC, and got me blackballed from CBC.
Wow.
So so I'm blackballed from CBC.
I didn't know that, Erica.
Yeah. So that's my experience with Canadian journalism.
Wow.
Yeah. So now, the other thing, like, I would be more upset if I thought that Canadian journalism in its current form would be around in 5 years. So that's the other thing. I'm like, well, I'll just wait you all out. You know what I mean? My interest right now, I've already dipped into America writing. So my focus right now is to do a little bit more investigative work, and I want to build that and my podcast, and I'm going to just have fun building that.
I'd like to come and cycle back around to getting more information, Erica, around the podcast and also the other project, Not in My Color. But I want you to speak to us about the two articles that were recently you wrote in the Hill Times. If you want to give us any context around what pressures or not, or how it went even getting it published. The two articles we're talking about is titled Selective Acknowledgement of Humanity, A Grim Sign of the Times, and also The Chill in the Air is More Than This Change of Seasons, both in the Hill Times.
So here's why I decided I was going to, focus on my own thing. It's because I'm lucky in the sense that I have a black editor. So one of the managing editors for the Hill Times is a black woman. And that brings a whole new experience. Okay? So I'm not really shut down with what I write. They just want to make sure that it's factual. Right? That's all. And so the other thing, too, is that Sherelle really, I thank her for when Pacinthe, I know what you mean by you pitched in a rage, okay?
Yeah.
I've written so ragey so many times that sometimes Sherelle has to be my backstop, right?
Right.
And she rounds out the edges rather than changing anything.
Exactly.
So, so that's why I don't want to deal with Canadian journalism right now. I'm looking at how they are dealing with, and then I'm going to get to the pieces, how they are dealing with Gaza right now. And on a business side, I just think after this, who's going to want to pay for your subscription? You know what I mean? Anyway. So, I said for the second time that I can remember, I'm deeply saddened. I'm embarrassed by the leadership of this country who have polluted what it means to be a human being, and it's up to us to push back at the one-sided nature of their performative empathy. Who gets to be the victims of the Israel-Hamas war is directly connected to whose aggression can be excused as legitimate. So I go on to kind of talk about, I give a synopsis of what happened. I made sure not to use the word terrorist or reason. And I think the word terrorist, as a black woman, I remember when Nelson Mandela was a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I'm very careful about, and I remember how the word terrorist was just bandied about during the Iraq War. Every brown person was a potential terrorist. I was like, no, I'm going to stay away from that language. I saw death, destruction, and a government that was hell-bent on seeing it through. And it was disgusting to me. It turned my stomach. I saw a media apparatus that was happy to engage in like rooting on this horrible destruction, this horrible, like, it's not just the loss of human life. It is the destruction of communities, of bodies, literally. I cannot imagine what it is like to be living that hell every day, every moment of the day, and not knowing whether or not you're going to be alive tomorrow, or if your children are, or if your family members are. This, to me, is horrific. And all I see is a media establishment and a political establishment, so those in power who are egging this on as though it's legitimate. This is not legitimate. So that's why I wrote those two. And then I saw a backlash of people in institutions that just 3 years ago were crying out for diversity, which I thought they were full of shit then, honestly. You know, and what are they doing? They are systematically silencing Palestinian voices and any voice that supports Palestinian voices. But it's very good to have a column right now. It's safer. Because I don't know if I would be published anywhere else at this point. I don't know. So I'm going to take a break from mainstream media. That is my point.
Wow.
Yeah. I will do like a spot here and a spot there, but I don't think my voice will be appreciated there. I don't trust who would be interviewing me unless they are of color, and sometimes even then. Like, I would have to have assurances that this would be done in good faith. And I don't have to answer the stupid question, do you believe Hamas is a terrorist organization? Like, oh my God, that is the extent of these interviews. It's like they want a blood oath. Yes, I believe Hamas is a terrorist organization. Like, honestly, every mainstream interview starts with that, or somewhere that question is embedded. And I don't want to have that discussion, and I don't want to have it in public. I want to have a deeper, more layered discussion. I want to have a discussion of how power got it so wrong. I want to have a discussion of how TikTok has influenced the perspective of people in general. I want to talk about these marches. I want to talk about how it must be awesome to be a right-wing provocateur right now. Like, that's what I want to talk about. That's the important stuff. Like, that, and are we planning to occupy Gaza? What are we planning to do here? What's our role here? Are we planning to, like white supremacy colonize Gaza? Like, what are we trying to do? There's been no talk about that. All it's been is rah, 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 like it's some friggin' video game. It is disgusting. It turns my stomach, and I want no part of this.
Pacinthe, what are your reflections when you hear this from Erica with the state of journalism as it is in this country?
You can hear a pin drop. It's just like I really understand and share a lot of Erica's frustrations with our profession, with our industry, specifically here in Canada, and you know what has kind of. I mean, there's a lot to be disappointed in, and it's not necessarily new. Many of us have been kind of talking about this stuff for years, but for me, and just especially in the last week or so, although it's been going on for longer, I have personally been so saddened, but perhaps not surprised at the abject silence of our journalism community about the targeting of Palestinian journalists in Gaza. And the number of journalists who have been targeted, I think we're at over 40 journalists now who have been targeted by Israel since the start of the attack on October 7th. And the Committee to Protect Journalists said that this is the most deadly conflict they have ever tracked for journalists since they began collecting this information in 1992. And I just think, you know, if these journalists, who are all Arab, I would say, most of them are Palestinian, one was Lebanese. I think there have been 2 Israeli journalists that have been killed as well, 2 Israelis that were killed in the attacks on October 7th. And then the rest are Palestinian and Lebanese. And yes. I just have this, you know, there's no way to prove this with absolute certainty, but I have a very strong hunch that if these journalists who were being unceremoniously targeted, and not just targeted, like, while they're in the field as war correspondents. I mean, journalists should not be targeted under any circumstances, but this is not like fog of war deaths. In some of these cases, these journalists have been targeted in their homes while they slept. Their families have been targeted with them. I have been haunted by, there's the Gaza bureau chief of Al Jazeera. His name is Wael al-Dahdour. And within the last 2 weeks, you know, the world watched as Wael found out in real time that while he was on the air reporting about Israel's attacks on Gaza, his own family was killed. His wife, his daughter, and son were all killed in the home where they slept. And this was supposedly in the safe area of Gaza that they had evacuated to. He hadn't seen them since the start of the war. And I watched in horror as this man, in his press vest, in his press helmet, is walking towards the hospital where crowds have gathered. You know, it is a very chaotic scene, but he is going to go find his now dead family that was targeted while he was on the air, and he picks up one of his children who is shrouded in white, and he's just, in the look on his face will haunt me for years to come. And what's so staggering to me is the next day, this man has just suffered immeasurable loss. And the next day, he was on the air on Al Jazeera Live saying, I have a duty to report in these times with utmost professionalism and transparency, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. And just a couple of days ago, Wael was once again, you know, now he's on the move. He's one of millions of residents who are evacuating to safety and have fled their homes because there is nowhere safe in Gaza. And that is true for the civilians. And, you know, here's what I'll say. In the media, we can contort ourselves to be like, oh, well, the civilians, I'm not sure, like, which ones deserve to be safe, who has the right to safety and who doesn't, like the way that Erica was alluding to, who gets empathy, who gets humanity. So there's a kind of question about civilians here. However, and I'm being a little bit facetious for a moment, but what I want to say is I'm shocked that even with journalists themselves being targeted here, journalists themselves are being targeted, and our profession has said very little. I mean, Reporters Without Borders has they did their own investigation because there was a Reuters photojournalist named Assam Abdullah who was killed in Israeli shelling in Lebanon, where he was reporting on the border. And when he was killed, initially there was confusion about how did he die? Do we know which side the gunfire or the attack came from? And Reporters Without Borders had to do their own investigation to conclude that it was shelling that came from Israel. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just shocked that our industry hasn't really said anything about this indiscriminate targeting of journalists and their families. And I just have this feeling that if these journalists were Western journalists with highly recognizable names that worked on big cable news channels, and I think the journalistic world would be up in arms. We would have seen such strong condemnation and action and perhaps action on this. But because these men, their names are, Isam and Ahmed and Muhammad and Yusuf, it just doesn't garner the same amount of alarm. And of course, there's the ever-hanging question of but were they with Hamas? Was Hamas nearby? Maybe, Israel was just targeting Hamas, and maybe this is an accident. But we all know that Israel has a very sophisticated military, extremely capable. They have records and registries of where everyone lives in the occupied Palestinian territories, and in Gaza, and they have a history of targeting journalists in the past. Shireen Abu Akleh was killed 18 months ago by an Israeli sniper, and they once again denied that at the beginning and only to own up to it later. So, in short, a long rant on where is the international journalism community, where's the Canadian journalism community to speak out against the targeting of our fellow journalists. And I just think it could very easily, if I was reporting in the region, it could very well have been me who was targeted, and I'm not even sure that anyone in the journalism community would say anything about it.
Yeah, no doubt. With Shireen being a dual citizen, I think she was an American citizen as well. And again, very little has been coming out of this from the people that you would imagine being concerned, the professional community. Journalism has, in recent years, I guess since, I'm tracking it since 9/11, when governments around the world were bringing in anti-terrorism laws, there was a lot of pressure on journalists to question this, to talk about it. Guantanamo Bay was happening, and so on. There were some global movements, and I remember associations of journalists speaking out, but by and least they are involved. It almost seems that mainstream media now is as we maybe have come to understand it, so corporatized that they have their own narrow perspectives and agendas. And if brown journalists are being killed, it's a war that we are rooting for the other side, whereas if it were Ukrainian journalists that were targeted by Russians, perhaps it might be a different story.
Oh, it would have been a different story, that's no doubt. I know, trust me, I've been to enough galas, awards and stuff where when it was Ukrainian journalists, there was a lot of condemnation. But now that it's brown, Palestinian, and Arab journalists, we have created and emphasized and implemented a narrative about brown people in the Middle East. And that is, they are all sleeper cells. They're all would-be terrorists. And that came from 9/11, or at least it came to a certain threshold in 9/11. And I truly feel that the Islamophobia goes back to 9/11. It goes probably back to Beirut. to be honest. But, you know, in this...
Current form, yeah, sure.
Yeah, in this, like, third form, that's what it is. And I truly think that Canadian media are guilty of suppressing certain stories because they don't like the narrative of who the victim is. And so I think that that's the way that Canadian journalism upholds, one of the ways it upholds white supremacy.
And so we've been talking a really long time, and I guess I wanted to ask you, as in terms of bringing this particular discussion to a close, I hope that we can talk again. What are some of the productive values, or in other words, what are some of the reasons that media, in your estimation, at least in the Canadian context, wants to constrict itself so much? I mean, are there external pressures? Are there just a lack of training? I mean, we hear about diversity a lot, and sure, on the CBC, I do see a lot of diverse faces. Sometimes the stories they bring sometimes are interesting. Sometimes they're just sort of mainstream stories that I could see from any generic reporter. What are some of the reasons you think that media wants to constrain itself so much, or not discuss issues that are relevant to folks of color?
Honestly, I think it has a lot to do with just like who is making the decision making in media. I mean, if you really want to boil it down, I think it's like plain old-fashioned racism, which is a very big word, but how it manifests is that the people who make editorial decisions overwhelmingly are of this is a general, like a general kind of classification, but they are, you know, white, upper middle class people who are in positions of editorial leadership, and this is across the board in Canadian media and media at large. And that's not to say that there aren't, you know, black people or racialized people or indigenous people in editorial leadership positions, but the higher up you go in all of these news organizations, the less of them there are. And so why does that matter? It's because when someone like me or Erica comes in and then pitches a story about anti-black racism or about police brutality or you know what, even about the joy of like, oh, let's meet this, you know, this amazing community leader who is now running a science organization for low-income children in Toronto. Let's look at the success stories from communities that don't often get that kind of shine. Overwhelmingly, it's just like there's a disconnect. They don't see why we should do this story. Sometimes they don't believe the story is relevant to Canadians, quote unquote. This is some of the stuff you get, not relevant. Or they are doubting that it happened if you're talking about, you know, allegations of violence leveled against racialized people. So the decision making of what gets to make the air is suddenly skewed a certain way. Because even if you have people who are from different communities, they're not the ones making the decisions, and fundamentally we have different lived experiences, different values, and that doesn't get reflected. So that's my kind of 101 explanation as to why it's like that. But it's a lot more layered than that. Erica, what do you think?
I think that, I think they love, white supremacy is a hell of a drug. I will just say that. It is everything. Here's the thing. I think that they have a very old way of looking at things still. What is it? White is right. Male is everything. And there's a classism to it too. And if you look at any story having to do with the workplace, they're always interviewing the business owner. They're always interviewing the boss. And it's like the workers get no airtime unless they're on strike or something, right?
Unless they're the problem.
Yeah, if you even look at that, the fact that we only started talking about renters in the housing crisis recently. You know, there is stuff on the cutting room floor that is gold. Okay, that actually a lot of Canadians want to hear, but they don't think of their viewer as one of us. And if they do, then they just think that we've assimilated to them. And that centering of their whiteness, their class, and even their gender, if you look at how trans rights has been covered, it's not good, for example. And so I remember being in a meeting about, what are we going to do when we, with harassment and so on. So these big wigs from like Global and like Star are there, right? And I mentioned like a social media campaign and rollout, and they looked at me like I had 5 heads. Because they don't understand the industry they're in either. And that experience was so eye-opening to me. I talked to my own paper. Hey, C18 is here. You've been blocked. What are y'all going to do? So in other words, the ways in which media's failed to expand their audience. And that is a business decision, I feel. And I feel that business decision is on purpose, right? They have failed to expand an audience racially. They've failed to capture 2 generations. They've lost 2 generations. They've lost millennials, and they've lost Gen Z. I don't know how they're going to survive. And so them digging in to, they're not even both siding this war. Like, that's what's killing me. A media that both sides everything, every little thing, is not both siding these wars. And what that tells me is that mainstream media has become the parrot for the powerful class that runs this country. That's what I feel.
I suppose it always was, Erica.
Yeah, I feel they speak for power. And it's just that we're like talking to each other now more. And if you look at TikTok is heavily pro-Palestinian.
Yes.
And the fact that they have no clue about TikTok, I could see why they are getting it so wrong. Because as I said before, why would you pay for a subscription if you're younger than the age of 45? Why would you do that? If they're not reflecting your views, which are more diverse, the younger you get, like they can't even report on climate change properly. And how long has that been? So there are a set of views, a specific set of views that don't really see the light of day until a catastrophe happens. And then they don't have the range because they haven't built the capacity.
That's right.
So right now, you could tell they don't have the range because they decided to suppress Palestinian voices in like 2018, 2017, 2016. Those people left. Some of those people left. Pacinthe is not there anymore, for example. And now people are seeing you fire your Palestinian reporters. So I'm not sure what this is supposed to prove. And I'm not sure I know why they keep shooting themselves in the foot, because they think that they're attracting the people who can pay, I guess. But they're also alienating future payments, if you could say.
Right.
If I could put it in a business economic way.
Sure. And that does totally make sense. Absolutely. And when you look at it from that perspective. Scent?
Yeah, oh man, I think Erica said it all. Like there is I think media is reflecting the tastes and dispositions and values of the people who are in leadership in media. And as Erica's saying, that's not what the TikTok generation is thinking. That's not, I mean, like in a city like Toronto, you know, Toronto is over 50% non-white now. And so when a city that's over 50% non-white looks at its media and does not see itself reflected at all, it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. And, you know, Erica put it in a stark kind of business way, and I think she's right. You know, if media does not start reflecting the people who live here and want to see themselves reflected, like, the business case is going to be a bad one, because why should they invest in a place that does not even see them, in good times or in bad? So there is a remarkable, I think, looming business. I mean, we're already in the business crisis of journalism, and I think that's also part of why it's so challenging. But it certainly does not bode well for the future.
Well, listen, we're going to have to leave it there, you two. We pushed almost an hour. Thank you so much for...
An hour already?
Yeah. It's been almost that. So thank you so much. But any last words? I mean, you know, time is just all relative anyway. I mean, we're co-op radio. We don't have to cut to a commercial or anything anytime soon.
I'm going to leave with this. Go read Pacinthe's Walrus article. It, to this day, is the article I have referenced the most.
Oh. Thank you, Erica.
And listen to that and Bitchy.
But no, listen, tell us.
I just want to say, I want to pick up that gold from the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I want the journalists who are frustrated that it got cut, I want them to come on and talk about it and be like, look, this is why this is important. And this is what I see, and this is what I've been reporting on, and this blah, 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 blah. That's what I want. I want to give people who have been pushed out, who do great work, just a platform.
Well, I would really like to extend another invite to have a conversation about a few other media outlets that we do have in Canada that purport to do something like that, Erica. But I also wanted to ask you to let our listeners know a little bit about the two projects that we had mentioned you were involved with, Not in My Color and Bad and Bitchy podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
So Bad and Bitchy, I've kind of explained, it's the podcast that it does politics in context. Facts, context, history. That's how we roll.
Okay.
Wow, those are amazing things that we don't have a lot of with media.
Yes. Because, yes, I was also a researcher at one point. Mm-hmm. Not in journalism, but in economics, right? Mm-hmm. And so I understand how important that is to put news and politics into context and to slow the news down so we can all get a grasp on what's happening around us. And I want to do it, and we do it from like a digital piece too, because that's where most people are. Not in My Color is more of the research projects. So I did a research project with McGill earlier this year about speaking a little bit on some of the things and more talking about the regulatory failure of what happened in journalism, because there is a government piece to that too.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the diversity piece too. I think, what is it, a third of the country, or 40% at least of the country is going to be non-white in like a generation. 40-45%. Just under half. Something like that. Imagine. Okay. So we don't have a media that is planning for that. We have a media that's still stuck in 85. And so, anyway, not in my color, just more of the research stuff. The analysis, etc.
Thank you.
Project work. Yeah.
And Pacinthe, can you tell listeners also where they might find some of your work and what you are doing these days?
You can find my work at my website, which is just like www.pacinthe.com. Just like Beyonce, one word only, PACINTHE.com. And I'm on Instagram and I'm on Twitter. And so between those three places, you'll find some of my work. Okay. And I mean, right now I am in a new state, or not new, but I am now an independent journalist,
awesome.
Which is a terrifying but also liberating thing, because these days I have been saying yes to every media opportunity to talk about Palestine and Israel coverage, because I think it's a conversation that we haven't been having. And so I've been speaking to Al Jazeera. I did 2 interviews with them. I did one on CP24 and one on Canada Land, and all of those are things that you can watch and find on my website. And so that is what I've been working on a lot these days, is just talking about media coverage of this, because I think it's very crucial that we understand it. And that's what I can do as an independent journalist now, because no one can fire me.
Well, thank you for the both of you very much for taking this time out and joining us and sharing your experiences and your analysis with us. And I hope we can catch up again as we go.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I had a great time. And this is a discussion that I thought was very nice and nuanced. I love nuance.
Yes.
We need more of that in journalism too, but I know that's not going to happen.
Sure do.
But since I will see you when I see you, but I'm sure I will see you, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I sure will. Yes, we'll take care.
Yes. You too. And thank you.
My pleasure.
Radio.
Thank you.
And thank you for providing a safe space.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Miller. Bye.
Bye. Okay, and there we have it. Wow, let's see what happens. As we chug along, we still are here at CFRO and also at www.coopradio.org. We are also on your dial at 100.5 FM. As we transition over to the Rational, we are going to be joined with Eve Engler and Dimitri Laskarias, talking more about what's going on in terms of Canada and Gaza, and media and politicians. Before that, as we set that up, we are going to have a listen to a spoken word by Rafif Ziadeh. It's called We Teach Life, Sir. And we'll be right back.